The moment that changed everything. Julian Montgomery had built his life around precision and control. A self-made millionaire, his days were dictated by calculated decisions, business expansions, and a meticulously organized schedule that left no room for distractions. His estate, a grand mansion perched on the rolling green hills of the countryside. Was more than just a home. It was a symbol of his relentless pursuit of success. Everything in Julian's life had its place, its function. And until that moment, he had never once questioned the order of things. Until he did. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. Julian was returning from a meeting, walking through the glass-paneled hallways of his mansion, when a movement outside the large garden window caught his eye. At first, he didn't think much of it. His estate staff often roamed the gardens, tending to the flowers or preparing the terrace for evening gatherings. But then his gaze sharpened. It was his 10-year-old son, Oliver. And he was dancing. Julian's footsteps slowed, curiosity replacing his usual tunnel vision. His son had never been one for physical activities. Unlike other children his age who played sports or spent their afternoons running through fields, Oliver had always been reserved, distant, and, in recent years, painfully withdrawn. And yet there he was, moving with an energy Julian had not seen in him since his wife passed away 3 years ago. But that wasn't what shocked him the most. It was who was dancing with him. A woman. Not just any woman. Elena, the maid. She was dressed in the typical uniform of the estate staff. A crisp black and white dress, her dark curls neatly pinned back, her expression filled with encouragement. But it wasn't the attire that stood out. It was the way she moved. Julian had seen dancers before. At corporate events, at luxury galas, even on rare nights when he had attended the ballet to appease business partners. But none of them moved like her. Her steps weren't just graceful. They were precise, controlled, filled with a depth of emotion that no mere hobbyist could possess. She wasn't just dancing with Oliver. She was teaching him, guiding him. His son, usually hesitant, followed her lead with an eagerness Julian hadn't seen in years. He stumbled once, his small hands gripping Elena's for support, and instead of frustration, he laughed. A genuine, carefree laugh that rang through the air like music. It hit Julian like a punch to the gut. His son hadn't laughed like that in a long time. For the first few moments, Julian simply watched, unable to process what he was seeing. Oliver looked happy, alive. There was no trace of the quiet sadness that had shadowed him since his mother's passing. And it was because of her. A maid. A woman he had barely noticed since she was hired 6 months ago. A strange mix of emotions brewed inside him. Curiosity, confusion, and something dangerously close to irritation. Why was she teaching his son to dance? Why hadn't Oliver come to him if he was interested in dancing? And more importantly, who was Elena, really? Julian had never been the type to let questions go unanswered. He turned abruptly, his polished dress shoes clicking against the stone path as he made his way toward the garden. The closer he got, the more his presence became impossible to ignore. Oliver was the first to notice him. His smile faded, replaced by uncertainty. He instinctively pulled back, stepping away from Elena. Elena, however, remained calm. She simply let go of Oliver's hands, straightened her posture, and turned to face Julian. There was no fear in her eyes. No nervousness, no scrambling to justify herself like most of his employees did in his presence. Just quiet confidence. Julian wasn't sure why, but that unsettled him the most. What exactly is going on here? His voice was smooth but cool, controlled. Oliver shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his father's gaze. Elena, on the other hand, held her ground. "We were practicing, Senior Montgomery," she said simply. Julian narrowed his eyes. Practicing what exactly? Dancing. She spoke as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, as if it were natural, as if it were normal. But nothing about this was normal. Julian turned his attention to his son. Since when did you want to learn how to dance? Oliver hesitated, glancing at Elena for a brief second before answering. For a while now, he admitted quietly. A sharp pang of guilt struck Julian's chest. How had he not noticed? How had he missed this? Julian exhaled slowly, keeping his emotions in check. And why didn't you tell me? Oliver hesitated again, then shrugged. Before he could answer, Elena spoke. Because he had no one to practice with, she said, her voice steady. Julian's gaze snapped back to her. There was something about the way she said it, firm, unwavering, without hesitation. He didn't like it. He didn't like that she had become an influence in his son's life without him even realizing it. This isn't your job, Julian stated. Elena tilted her head slightly. No, it isn't. Then why are you doing it? She folded her arms, expression unreadable. Because he asked me to. Julian turned back to Oliver. Is that true? The boy nodded. A heavy silence stretched between them. Julian exhaled sharply, irritation clawing at his composure. There was something about this entire situation that felt off. Something he couldn't see. And that was unacceptable. His gaze flickered back to Elena, studying her closely. Who was she, really? There was something beneath the surface, something hidden. And Julian was going to find out what it was. He straightened his posture, pushing his emotions aside. I need to speak with you, alone. Oliver's brows furrowed in concern, but Elena remained composed. As you wish, Senior Montgomery. Julian turned sharply, heading back toward the house without waiting to see if she followed. Yet, just before he stepped inside, he cast a glance over his shoulder. Oliver had leaned toward Elena, whispering something to her. She responded quietly, her expression unreadable. And then the boy let out a small, conspiratorial smile. A chill ran down Julian's spine. There was something more to this, something he wasn't seeing, and he was determined to uncover it. The secrets beneath the surface. The air inside the Montgomery estate was thick with an unfamiliar tension as Julian strode through the hallway, his mind racing with questions. Who was Elena, really? It wasn't just the dancing that unsettled him. It was the way she carried herself, with an unshakable grace, an unspoken confidence that didn't belong to a maid. He had hired her through an agency 6 months ago, barely sparing a glance at her resume. His estate staff was meant to blend into the background, to keep his world in perfect order without interruption. Yet here she was, breaking the very structure he had built. As he entered his office, the heavy wooden doors closed behind him with a soft click. He expected Elena to falter, to hesitate under his scrutiny. But when he turned to face her, she stood tall, unflinching. Julian leaned against his desk, studying her. How long have you been teaching my son to dance? Her hands were clasped neatly in front of her. A few weeks. He frowned. And you never thought to inform me. A slight tilt of her head. Would you have listened? The directness of her response made something tighten in his chest. He exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. That's not for you to decide. Elena held his gaze. Neither is Oliver's happiness, yet here we are. The words struck a nerve, though Julian refused to show it. This woman, this maid, was not only standing up to him, but challenging him. His fingers drummed against the polished wood of his desk. You're not just a maid, are you? A flicker of something. Asterisk, asterisk, was it amusement? Asterisk, asterisk, crossed her face. No, Senior Montgomery, she admitted, her voice calm. I am not. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Julian straightened, his gaze sharp. Then who are you? Elena exhaled, as if preparing herself. A long time ago, I was a dancer. There it was. The answer he had expected, but not yet fully understood. His jaw tightened. And now you clean houses. For the first time, something unreadable flickered in her eyes. Not everything goes as planned. That response alone was not enough for Julian. He wanted the full story. Why did you stop? He pressed. A pause. A flicker of something deeper, pain, perhaps. Because I had to. That was it. No dramatic explanation, no self-pity, just a simple statement of fact. Julian studied her, his mind working through possibilities. She had the training of a professional. That much was clear. So why would someone with that level of skill disappear into a life of anonymity? There was something here, something bigger than what she was willing to say. But before he could press further, Alina spoke. "Does it bother you, Senior Montgomery?" Her voice was smooth, unreadable. "That your son enjoys dancing?" His frown deepened. "Of course not." "Then why does this upset you?" He opened his mouth to respond, and then hesitated. Why did it upset him? Was it because he had been unaware of Oliver's interest in dancing? Because someone else had stepped into a role that should have been his? Or was it something more? Something about her? Julian inhaled sharply, pushing those thoughts aside. "My concern is my son's well-being," he stated firmly. Not what?" Alina interrupted, arching a brow. "Not you," he finished, though the words didn't feel entirely true. Another beat of silence. And then, unexpectedly, she smiled. Not a mocking smile, not one of defiance, but something softer, knowing. "I think it does," she murmured. "Bothered you?" His muscles tensed. "Excuse me?" "Not the dancing." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with the same piercing intensity he had turned on her. "But the fact that Oliver is opening up, and you weren't the one who made it happen." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Because they were true. Julian clenched his jaw, swallowing back the sudden wave of emotion rising in his chest. Before he could speak, Alina stepped forward, not in defiance, not in challenge, but with quiet certainty. "He needed someone, Senior Montgomery," she said gently. "And I was there." He hated how those words made him feel. Because despite everything, he knew she wasn't wrong. And that realization shook him more than anything else. The search for answers. That night, after Alina had left his office, Julian sat in his chair, staring at his computer screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Alina Vargas. The name sounded familiar, but why? He typed it into the search bar, pressing enter. Dozens of results appeared. Restaurant workers, social media profiles, unrelated news articles. But then, near the bottom of the page, something caught his eye. A headline. "Rising ballet prodigy disappears from the stage without explanation." Julian's breath stilled. He clicked the article. A photograph loaded. A younger version of Alina stood on a grand stage, dressed in an elegant ballet costume, her arms raised in perfect form, her expression poised yet filled with an undeniable passion. The article described her as a rare talent, a dancer destined for greatness. She had trained with the best, performed in prestigious theaters. Then, suddenly, she vanished. No scandal, no injuries, no official announcement. Just gone. Julian leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. Why would someone with that level of talent abandon everything? Why was she here, cleaning houses, teaching his son? The questions circled in his mind, each one leading to another. But there was one thing he knew for sure. Alina wasn't just a maid. She was a mystery. And Julian Montgomery did not leave mysteries unsolved. Unraveling the past and facing the truth. Julian sat motionless in his leather chair, his eyes locked onto the screen. The name Alina Vargas now carried a weight he hadn't expected. A ballet prodigy. A rising star. And then, gone. The article was old, buried under years of forgotten headlines, but it told a story that was impossible to ignore. Alina had been one of the most promising dancers of her generation, celebrated for her unmatched precision and emotional depth on stage. She had performed in the world's most prestigious theaters, her name whispered among those destined for greatness. And yet, one day, without warning, she had vanished. No scandal, no explanation, just a quiet disappearance. And now, she was here, in his home, working as a maid. Julian exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. He was a man who built his success on reading people, on knowing their ambitions, their motivations. And yet, for 6 months, he had completely overlooked her. That realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. There was only one way to get the answers he needed, and he wasn't going to wait any longer. The confrontation. The clatter of silverware echoed softly through the vast kitchen as Alina moved through her routine. She was cleaning up after dinner, her movements methodical, precise, just like the way she danced. She sensed him before she saw him. The heavy presence of Julian Montgomery filled the room, the subtle shift in the air announcing his arrival. She didn't turn around immediately, taking her time as she placed a dish on the drying rack before finally looking up. "Senor Montgomery," she greeted, her tone calm. "You don't usually come to the kitchen this late." Julian stepped forward, sliding his phone onto the counter between them. The article about her past glowed on the screen. "Explain this," he said, his voice firm but controlled. Alina's gaze flickered to the phone, her expression unreadable. For the first time since he had met her, she hesitated. She didn't immediately deny it. She didn't try to deflect. She simply sighed. "I should have known you'd find out eventually," she murmured, wiping her hands on a dish towel before setting it down. Julian crossed his arms. "Why did you leave?" Alina held his gaze, her brown eyes steady. "Because I had no choice." "That's not an answer." She exhaled, leaning slightly against the counter. "Do you know what it takes to be a ballerina at that level, Senor Montgomery?" Julian didn't respond. "It's more than talent. It's more than discipline. It's your entire life. Every waking moment is devoted to perfection, training, rehearsing, performing. There is no room for anything else. No room for mistakes. No room for weakness." A shadow crossed her face, as if she were momentarily lost in the past. "I was one of the best, and yet that wasn't enough." Julian narrowed his eyes. "What happened?" A long silence stretched between them before she finally spoke. "My mother got sick," she said softly. He stilled. "She was my only family, and she needed me." Alina let out a quiet breath. But in the world of ballet, there is no such thing as pausing your career. There is no slowing down. If you step away, even for a moment, they replace you. And that's exactly what happened. Her fingers curled slightly against the counter, but her voice remained steady. "I left to take care of her. I thought I'd come back when she recovered, but she never did." The words lingered in the air between them. Julian wasn't easily moved by emotion. Years of business dealings had trained him to remain detached. But something about this story, about her, made something shift inside him. "You gave up your dream for her," he said, his voice quieter now. Alina nodded. "I didn't see it as giving up. I saw it as choosing love over ambition." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent years chasing success, believing that sacrifice was the price of greatness. But here she was, standing before him, proof that there was another path, one he had never dared to take. "And after she passed?" he asked. Alina gave a small bitter smile. "By then, it was too late. I was forgotten." She looked away for a moment, as if shaking off old memories. "I tried to go back, but the doors that were once open were closed. So I let it go. I built a new life, away from that world." Julian studied her for a long moment. "Why work as a maid?" he finally asked. Alina chuckled softly. "Would you believe me if I said I liked the simplicity of it?" He raised an eyebrow. She sighed, shaking her head. "Honestly, I needed a job, something stable, something far away from the expectations of my past." A silence stretched between them, charged with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Julian spoke. "Why teach Oliver?" Alina's gaze softened. "Because he asked me to, and because I saw a part of myself in him. The part that was once so eager to move, to express something beyond words." She hesitated, I know what it's like to feel trapped by expectations, Senior Montgomery. And I couldn't let him feel that way too. Julian exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had spent so much time structuring Oliver's life, ensuring he had everything he needed. Education, security, discipline. But had he given him happiness? The thought unsettled him. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he had been doing things right. Elena must have sensed his inner turmoil because she smiled slightly. Oliver is talented, you know. He learns quickly. Julian smirked faintly. He gets that from me. Elena laughed, a warm, genuine sound that made the tension in the room ease. Of course he does. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two people from entirely different worlds, standing in the same space, connected by something neither had expected. Julian finally broke the silence. If Oliver wants to keep learning, I won't stop him. Elena's brows raised slightly. You approve? He exhaled, glancing away. Let's just say I'm reconsidering my views on certain things. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. That's a good start. As Julian turned to leave, he paused at the door, glancing over his shoulder. Elena. She looked up. You may have left the stage, he said, but I don't think the stage ever left you. A flicker of something crossed her face, something unreadable, but unmistakably alive. And as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something neither of them saw coming. A new dance begins. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the large windows of the Montgomery estate, casting golden beams across the polished marble floors. The world outside moved as it always had, predictable, orderly, controlled. But something inside Julian Montgomery had shifted. He stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, his mind unusually unfocused. He was a man who built his empire on certainty, on knowing every move before making it. And yet, for the first time in years, he found himself standing at the edge of the unknown. Oliver was dancing. Not alone. Elena was with him again. Julian hadn't intervened this time. He simply watched. Oliver moved with a newfound confidence, his small frame more certain in its steps, his laughter genuine. And Elena, she was radiant. There was something about the way she moved, the way she guided Oliver, the way she made even the air around her feel lighter. It was as if she had never left the stage at all. And Julian saw it now. She wasn't teaching him steps. She was teaching him to express, to be free in a way Julian had never allowed himself to be. For so long, Julian had believed that discipline and control were the only ways to build something lasting. But watching them now, he realized he had been wrong. Sometimes, the most beautiful things in life weren't meant to be controlled. They were meant to be felt. A decision that changed everything. Later that afternoon, Julian found himself standing at the threshold of the kitchen again. Elena was there, as usual, tidying up after lunch. She sensed him before he spoke. "You're watching again," she said without turning around. Julian smirked faintly, observing. She turned to face him, crossing her arms, a playful glint in her eyes. "And what have you observed, Senior Montgomery?" He exhaled, leaning against the counter. "That you don't belong here." Elena's brow arched. "Excuse me. You don't belong in a kitchen." He studied her carefully. "You belong where people can see you. On a stage. Performing. Teaching." She tilted her head, amusement dancing in her gaze. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" Julian held her gaze. "I did some research last night. There's a dance academy opening in the city. They're looking for instructors, professionals." Elena's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly masked it. "I haven't danced professionally in years." "Doesn't mean you can't start again." She hesitated. "Why do you care?" Julian exhaled slowly, searching for the right words. "Because I know what it's like to bury a part of yourself for the sake of responsibility." A flicker of surprise crossed her face. He continued. "I spent years thinking success was about control. But Oliver, watching him dance, watching you, He shook his head slightly. I see now that some things aren't meant to be controlled. Some things are meant to be pursued, no matter the risk. Elena looked at him for a long moment. And then, softly, she asked, "Are we talking about me, or are we talking about you?" Julian's smirk returned. Maybe both. A pause. Then Elena chuckled, shaking her head. "You are a very complicated man, Julian Montgomery." His smirk deepened. "So I've been told." She glanced down, considering his words. For so long, she had convinced herself that that part of her life was over, that she had made peace with the choices she had made. But maybe she had been wrong. Finally, she looked up at him, a quiet determination in her gaze. "All right," she said. "I'll audition." Julian nodded. "Good." Elena grinned, but on one condition. He raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" She stepped closer, amusement dancing in her eyes. "You have to learn to dance too." Julian blinked. "What?" Elena crossed her arms. "You expect me to step out of my comfort zone, but you won't do the same. That doesn't seem fair, does it?" He scoffed. "I'm a businessman, not a dancer." She smirked. "And I was a maid, wasn't I?" "Touché." Julian exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Fine, but if I fall on my face, you're responsible." Elena laughed. "Deal." She extended a hand. And for the first time in his life, Julian Montgomery did something completely spontaneous. He took it. An unwritten future. That night, as Oliver peeked through the doorway, he couldn't help but grin. There, in the center of the dimly lit ballroom, his father, Julian Montgomery, the man who had always been stiff, composed, and entirely too serious, was dancing. Badly. Very badly. But laughing. And for the first time in a long time, Oliver felt something he had never thought he'd feel again. Hope. Because sometimes life doesn't go as planned. Sometimes people break. They lose their way. But sometimes, if they're lucky, they find exactly what they never knew they needed. And that night, in a grand mansion filled with laughter and music, Julian Montgomery, Oliver, and Elena danced into a future none of them had seen coming. A future where dreams didn't have to be abandoned, where joy didn't have to be sacrificed, where life could be lived, not just controlled. And maybe, just maybe, it was only the beginning. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.